My name is Michael Wotorson, and I'm the director for the Campaign for High School Equity. Thank you very much for joining us this morning. As I always say at the start of each of our briefings, I like to try to have us start and end our programs on the same day. So I'd like to have us go ahead and get started. Let me first express our thanks and appreciation to the Office of Congressman Rush Holt for helping us to secure this space this morning. But also I'd like to acknowledge his important leadership on the Metrics Act, which would authorize about $150 million in formula grants for the development of statewide longitudinal data systems, an issue that we're very concerned about and we will talk about in large measure this morning, and also for his work on and support of the Graduation Promise Act, which would target about $2.5 billion to turning around low-performing schools. The Congressman wanted to be with us this morning, but his travel schedule prevented him from being here, but we are grateful to him and appreciative for his co-sponsorship of this morning's event. So I also want to thank all of you for being with us this morning. There are, I see one or two of my organizational partners from the Campaign for High School Equity that I would just like to publicly recognize. First, sitting up closest to me, Mr. David Perez from the League of United Latin American Citizens, and also sitting on the table here to my left, Ms. Duatar, the Executive Director of the Southeast Asia Resource Action Center. The Campaign for High School Equity is a coalition of national civil rights organizations dedicated to ensuring that high schools prepare all children, particularly children of color, for graduation, for college, and for work. Each of our organizations has a long and distinguished history in effectively working for deeper civil rights and for a stronger democracy in our nation. Given the collective experience of these organizations, we thought it necessary to come together and lend our voices and our energy to making sure that high schools, in fact, are more responsive to all students, but to students of color in particular. For those of you who have been to some of our other events over the past several months, you will recall that we have tried in a very concerted fashion, one, to make clear that from our standpoint, the reauthorization of No Child Left Behind is of the utmost importance to us because of what it has done in terms of shining the light on what is actually happening in this country to students of color in American high schools, but to pointing out some of the very specific policy adjustments and fixes that we would like to see in the reauthorization of No Child Left Behind. And the topic we're going to spend this morning talking about is one of those policy adjustments. We are gathered here today to talk about what for us is a very, very important issue, and that is how we use data to drive and promote a civil rights agenda in education and education reform. You know, if you think about the history of civil rights in this country and every gain that has been accomplished over the years, it has all started with data. Somewhere along the line, at the start of all of these wonderful gains that we've had, whether it's Brown v. Board, whether it's Mendez, whether it's the Voting Rights Act, what it all has started with is an examination of critical data, important data that provides us with the moral justification to continue to push for civil rights as a part of our discussions about democracy. Today, all across this country, school professionals, policymakers, parents, and advocates are working extremely hard to devise strategies that are best suited to closing the achievement gap. In 2007, for example, NAEP reports that only about 14% of African American students were classified as being proficient in reading compared to 42% of whites, while for math the ratio was 13% to 47%. Further, nearly half of all African American students were rated by NAEP as being below basic in reading compared to 19% of whites, while in math the ratio is 45% for blacks versus 19% whites. Obviously, if educators are going to close these gaps in achievement, there are important decisions that have to be made around instructional practices and around the ways in which the schooling process is organized. The question then becomes, on the basis of what kinds of information and what kind of data are these decisions to be made? How are we going to make these really, really critical decisions? From our standpoint, at the Campaign for High School Equity, we happen to believe that making decisions that affect all students without the benefit of fully disaggregated data has the potential to ignore the unique needs of students of color. In just about every school or district in our country, countless numbers of young people are being left behind because of the inaccurate or unreliable data that's being relied on from time to time to make important decisions about educational interventions, as the case may be. So, how are these young people being left behind? Well, without the appropriate interventions, their academic performance suffers, the likelihood that they will graduate on time with a regular diploma diminishes, and many of those students who may require special services never receive them, or the services that they do receive are inadequate or there are inappropriate matches. In short, students of color are deeply harmed when decisions are made about serving them without the benefit of reliable data. So what we'd like to do this morning is to talk about strategies for using accurate and reliable data and the information to guide key educational decisions. To that end, we are going to hear about strategies that can be implemented at the school, district, and state level for putting reliable data to use. We will also hear about the dangers of not adequately disaggregating data for special student populations and how that failure can render those populations invisible. Given the crisis we face today, the Campaign for High School Equity believes that important corrective and preventive action is needed now. And as I said earlier, for us, it begins fundamentally with the reauthorization of No Child Left Behind, but obviously doing so with strong emphasis on using disaggregated data to drive educational decision-making. Now, rather than getting into a lot of the specific details of what this should all look like, what I'd like to do is allow my esteemed colleagues who have gathered here this morning to share with you some of their perspectives. We are joined this morning by Dr. Charity Smith, who is an Assistant Commissioner for Education with the Arkansas Department of Education. Thank you so much for being with us, Dr. Smith. We're also joined by Mr. Quentin Romanos, who is a member of the Board of Directors with the National Indian Education Association. Mr. Romanos is also a tribal education leader. And correct me if I'm wrong, sir, I believe you are Cheyenne? Okay, I was glad I got it right. And we're also joined by Ms. Dua Ta, who is the Executive Director with the Southeast Asia Resource Action Center. So to get us started this morning, let me introduce Dr. Charity Smith, who will come to us first, and then we will move forward. Dr. Smith.